the pastor caught me and made his move. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the channel Infidelity Stories. Today, I've gathered the courage to share my story of how I was unfaithful to my husband by getting involved with our pastor. My name is Julia. I'm 28 years old, and for 5 years I was married to Samuel, the man I once believed was the love of my life. Our beginning felt like a fairy tale. We met at church, where our eyes met during a service that felt as though it had been orchestrated by God to bring us together. Samuel, at 32, was a civil engineer, deeply dedicated to his work and faith, just like me. At 28, I was fully invested in teaching children, pouring my heart and soul into my work. The early years of our marriage were filled with passion, love, and vibrancy. I believed that the intense connection between us was a divine gift. Samuel always found ways to show me how much I meant to him, and I felt loved, secure and whole by his side. Our relationship was a blend of fiery passion and peaceful harmony. Our faith and intimacy intertwined in a way that felt perfect. We were reserved in public, but behind closed doors, everything was full of fire and excitement. But as time went on, things began to change. Samuel's work began to take more of his time, and the late nights became increasingly common. The exhaustion that was once rare became a constant companion. The attentive man I fell in love with slowly started drifting away, and without realizing it, I began to feel more and more isolated. Our conversations, which had once been full of warmth and affection, became short, practical exchanges about the day-to-day. The flame that once fueled our relationship started to flicker, and I found myself yearning for something I wasn't sure Samuel could give me anymore. I remained active in the church, throwing myself into my responsibilities, trying to hide the growing unease inside me. I knew Samuel was working hard to build a future for us, but the emptiness I felt was hard to ignore. The loneliness settled in quietly, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was in this vulnerable state that I started noticing something different about Pastor Mark. At 40, he was a charismatic man with a strong presence. He was always kind to everyone, but I began to feel that he was especially attentive to me. Until then, I had never paid him much attention, but as my loneliness grew, his kindness and attentiveness took on a new weight. One afternoon, after choir practice, Pastor Mark asked me to stay back and talk. He wanted to know if everything was all right, if there was anything he could help with. His words were warm, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt truly heard. I confided in him about the distance between Samuel and me, about how I felt so alone and how things had changed in our marriage. Mark listened intently, never interrupting. His empathy was comforting, and I found myself relaxing in his presence, a feeling I hadn't experienced in so long. He spoke about how every marriage faces challenges and how it was important to keep faith and seek solutions through God. His words were wise and reassuring, but what struck me most was the understanding look in his eyes. It was as though he knew exactly what I was going through, something Samuel no longer seemed capable of. In the days that followed, Mark continued to check in on me. He would ask if things had improved and always offered a word of encouragement. The attention that had been absent at home became something I looked forward to. I knew I should have been focusing on saving my marriage, but the truth was, each encounter with Mark made me feel more alive and less alone. I tried to convince myself that what I felt was merely gratitude for his attention, but deep down, I knew it was more than that. The void Samuel had left was slowly being filled by these moments with Mark, and despite the confusion, it was hard to resist. I found myself torn between guilt and desire, between the commitment I had made to Samuel and the longing for something that made me feel whole again. Without realizing it, I started pulling away from Samuel and moving closer to Mark. I knew I was on dangerous ground, but I couldn't stop. Something inside me had changed, and I feared the consequences that this shift would bring. Our encounters became more frequent, and with each conversation, I felt something bloom inside me. It wasn't just the attention he gave me, but how he made me feel valued, important, even desired. It was a feeling I hadn't had in a long time. At home, Samuel remained trapped in his exhausting routine, and the distance between us seemed to grow wider with each passing day. Mark was always careful with his words, but there was something between the lines, an unspoken tension that I knew was dangerous, but at the same time, irresistible. I spent hours replaying our conversations in my mind, analyzing every gesture, every look, searching for signs that he felt the same way I did. The guilt began to consume me. I still loved Samuel, or at least the version of him I had known in the early years of our marriage, but the emptiness I felt was undeniable, and Mark's attention, no matter how wrong I knew it was, filled that void in ways I hadn't felt in so long. One Sunday afternoon, after the service, Mark asked me to meet him in the church office. As soon as we entered, he closed the door, and for a moment, the silence was overwhelming. I could hear my heart pounding. He began speaking about how much he cared for me, how he wanted to see me happy, and before I could react, he took my hand. His touch shattered every defense I had left. I knew we were crossing a line, but I couldn't pull away. I was enveloped by a mix of guilt and desire, a combination that left me powerless. All I knew in that moment was that I needed to feel something I had lost long ago. That afternoon, everything changed. When I felt Mark's hand on mine, it was as though the world around me disappeared. His simple touch stirred emotions in me that I could no longer control. He looked into my eyes, and in that instant, I knew there was no turning back. Mark moved closer, and what happened next seemed inevitable. His lips touched mine, and I didn't resist. The guilt that had been gnawing at me was replaced by an overwhelming desire, something I hadn't felt in so long. All my vows, everything that tied me to Samuel felt distant. For those brief moments in that small room, I forgot everything. My marriage, my promises, my faith. I was completely absorbed in the present, as if it was an escape from the emptiness that had been consuming me for so long. When we finally pulled away, the silence between us was deafening. I knew what had just happened was wrong, but a part of me didn't want to turn back. After that fateful afternoon, everything in my life began to unravel. The guilt weighed heavily on me, but every time I saw Mark, that weight would dissolve into something else, a dangerous, intoxicating desire. It was a pull I couldn't resist, no matter how much I tried. Our encounters became more frequent, and what began as furtive touches soon evolved into something much more. Every stolen moment with Mark filled me with a whirlwind of emotions I couldn't quite grasp. I knew deep down that what we were doing was wrong, that I was betraying everything I stood for, my marriage, my faith, and even my own sense of morality. Yet, in those moments with him, I felt alive, in a way I hadn't felt in years. At home, things with Samuel worsened. He worked late more often than ever, consumed by his projects. When he did come home, the space between us was palpable. We shared the same bed, but it felt as though we were worlds apart. The love that once bound us now felt like a distant memory, and every time I tried to reach out to him, it was like I was grasping at smoke. His mind was elsewhere, his heart even further. Samuel began to notice the change in me, though. I could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at me with quiet suspicion. He didn't say anything at first, but there were moments when I caught him staring at me, as if he was trying to figure out what was wrong. The tension in our home was becoming unbearable, and I knew I was walking on a razor's edge. Despite the guilt and the fear of being discovered, my relationship with Mark only deepened. We met in secret, away from the prying eyes of the church and our congregation. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word of affection between us made me feel like I was in a forbidden dream. But this dream had its cost, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. One evening, after another late night at work, Samuel confronted me. His voice was calm, but the hurt was evident in his tone. "Julia," he began, "you've been distant, I've noticed. Is there something going on that you're not telling me?" My heart raced, and for a moment I considered telling him everything, confessing my affair, my betrayal, and the deep loneliness that had driven me to this point. But I couldn't. The words stuck in my throat, and instead I shook my head, lying to the man who had given me everything. "No," I whispered, avoiding his gaze. "It's just work, stress. I've been feeling off." Samuel sighed, his expression a mixture of frustration and sadness. He didn't push further, but I could feel the distance between us growing wider with every passing day. Meanwhile, Mark was pressing me to make a choice. "Julia," he said one evening after we'd met in secret, "we can't keep doing this forever. Sooner or later, we'll be found out. I want to be with you, but we need to figure out what this means." His words filled me with both excitement and dread. The idea of leaving Samuel terrified me. I wasn't sure if I could bear the consequences of breaking my marriage vows, of tearing apart the life we had built. But with Mark, I felt something I hadn't felt in so long: passion, excitement, desire. It was an intoxicating mix that I couldn't shake. I began to wonder if I could have both, a life with Samuel and the secret affair with Mark. But deep down, I knew that was impossible. The lies were already starting to catch up with me, and I felt the walls closing in. Then one night, everything changed. Samuel had fallen asleep on the couch, exhausted from yet another long day at work. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when a message from Mark appeared. "I need to see you," it read. My heart leaped in my chest, a familiar thrill running through me. I knew it was dangerous, but I couldn't resist. I told myself it would just be a quick meeting, nothing more. I snuck out of the house, leaving Samuel, sleeping soundly. As I drove to the place where Mark and I always met, I felt a strange mix of guilt and excitement coursing through me. When I arrived, Mark was already waiting, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the streetlights. As soon as I stepped out of the car, he pulled me into his arms, his lips finding mine in a kiss that made me forget everything. Samuel, my marriage, the looming consequences. For a moment, it was just us, lost in the heat of the moment. But then, something shattered the illusion. Headlights appeared in the distance, and before I could even register what was happening, I saw Samuel's car pull up behind mine. My heart stopped. Panic surged through me as I watched Samuel step out of the car, his expression one of shock and betrayal. "Julia!" His voice broke as he called out my name, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had followed me, and now everything was out in the open. Mark stepped back, his face pale, as the reality of the situation hit both of us like a tidal wave. I turned to Samuel, trying to find the words to explain, but there was nothing I could say that would fix the damage I had done. The silence that followed was suffocating. Samuel's eyes filled with tears, his hands trembling as he looked between me and Mark. "How could you?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry," was all I could manage, but it was too little, too late. Without another word, Samuel got back into his car and drove away, leaving me standing there, my heart in pieces. I watched him go, knowing that I had destroyed everything. The man who had once loved me so deeply was now shattered by my betrayal, and there was no going back. Mark tried to comfort me, but his touch now felt cold. The excitement, the thrill, it was all gone, replaced by a crushing sense of guilt and regret. I had made my choice, and now I had to live with the consequences. In the days that followed, Samuel moved out of our home, filing for divorce. The whispers at the church grew louder, and it wasn't long before our affair became the talk of the congregation. I was ostracized, judged by the very community that once held me in high regard. Mark too faced backlash, but while he still had his position, I was left with nothing. The life I had built, the marriage I had vowed to cherish, was gone, and all I had left was the weight of my own choices and the knowledge that I had lost everything in my search for something more. The days following Samuel's departure were a blur of emotions, guilt, regret, and a deep, aching loneliness. My home, once filled with warmth and love, now felt cold and hollow. Every corner, every room was a reminder of the life I had shattered, the love I had betrayed. Samuel had moved out without a word, leaving behind the silence of a broken marriage and the emptiness of our shared memories. At church, things were even worse. The rumors had spread like wildfire. It wasn't long before the congregation knew about my affair with Pastor Mark. The once friendly smiles and warm embraces were replaced with cold stares and whispered judgments. I could feel the weight of their disapproval every time I walked into the building, and it stung in a way I hadn't anticipated. Pastor Mark tried to reassure me, promising that things would settle down, that we could move forward together. But his words felt hollow. The excitement, the thrill that had once made me feel alive, now felt like poison. Every glance we shared, every secret touch, was a reminder of the devastation we had caused, not just to Samuel, but to ourselves. One Sunday, just a few weeks after the night Samuel had caught us, I stood at the back of the church watching as the congregation gathered. The whispers were louder than ever, and I could feel their eyes on me, burning with judgment. Pastor Mark walked to the pulpit, his usual confident demeanor noticeably shaken. He began his sermon, but his voice lacked the authority and warmth it once had. And then it happened. A man stood up from the pews, interrupting the service. His voice was filled with anger as he addressed the congregation. "We deserve better," he shouted. "How can we trust a man who can't even uphold his own vows? How can he guide us when he's leading a life of sin?" The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to Pastor Mark. His face paled, and for a moment, I saw the man who had once seemed so strong and untouchable falter. The weight of his choices was catching up with him too. He tried to regain control of the situation, but the damage was done. People began to murmur, their faith in him shaken, their trust broken. The man's words hung in the air, and soon others began to stand, voicing their concerns, their disappointment. It was chaos. The congregation was divided, some still loyal to Mark, others furious at the betrayal. As I stood there, I realized that this wasn't just about Mark and me anymore. We had torn apart the very fabric of the church community, the place that had once been our sanctuary. I couldn't take it any longer. The guilt and shame were too much to bear. I slipped out of the church quietly, unnoticed amidst the uproar. Outside, the air was crisp, but it did little to soothe the storm raging inside me. For days, I stayed home, trying to process everything. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from people in the congregation, some offering support, others casting blame. But I couldn't bring myself to respond. I was lost, drowning in the consequences of my actions, and I had no idea how to find my way back. One evening, Mark showed up at my door. His face was worn, his usual charm nowhere to be found. He looked at me with a mixture of sadness and desperation. "Julia," he began, his voice strained. "I'm losing everything. The congregation. They want me gone. The church board is meeting tomorrow to decide whether I can stay on as pastor." I felt a pang of guilt, knowing that I was partly responsible for the chaos that had consumed his life. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was inevitable, that we had set ourselves on this path the moment we crossed that line. "I don't know what to do," Mark continued, his voice breaking. I thought we could get through this together, but now, everything's falling apart. I didn't know how to respond. A part of me wanted to comfort him, to tell him that we could make it through this. But another part of me, deeper, quieter, but growing stronger by the day, knew that this was the end. I had already lost Samuel, and now I was on the verge of losing everything else. Clinging to this affair, to Mark, wasn't going to fix anything. It would only make things worse. "I can't do this anymore, Mark," I said quietly, my voice barely above a whisper. His eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, I saw the vulnerability behind his confident exterior. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I mean, this. Us." "It's over," I said, feeling the weight of the words as they left my lips. "We've hurt too many people. I've lost everything, and I can't keep going down this road. I need to find a way back. Back to myself, back to some kind of peace." and I can't do that with you." Mark's face fell, and I could see the pain in his eyes, but deep down, I knew it was the right choice. This affair had consumed us both, and it had destroyed everything in its path. After a long, heavy silence, Mark nodded, slowly. "I understand," he said quietly. "I never wanted this to happen, Julia. I never wanted to hurt you." "I know," I replied, my heart heavy. "But we did." He left that night, and as I watched him walk away, I felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't the ending I had imagined, but it was the ending I needed. In the days that followed, I started the slow, painful process of picking up the pieces of my life. Samuel and I never spoke again, the divorce papers arriving quietly in the mail. The church too moved on. Mark was asked to step down, and a new pastor was brought in to restore order. I too distanced myself from the church, unable to face the people I had once considered family. The loneliness was overwhelming at times, but slowly I began to find a new rhythm. I started seeing a therapist, trying to understand how I had let things spiral so far out of control. It wasn't easy, and there were days when the weight of my mistakes felt unbearable. But over time, I began to heal. I learned to forgive myself for the choices I had made, though it took a long time to accept the consequences. I realized that my affair with Mark wasn't just about desire or passion. It was about filling a void, a deep loneliness that I hadn't addressed in my marriage. As the months passed, I began to reconnect with the person I had lost along the way, the woman who had once been so full of love, faith, and hope. I knew I could never undo the past, but I could learn from it. I could move forward, even if it meant starting over completely. And so, that's what I did. I moved to a new town, far away from the memories of my old life. I found a small apartment, started teaching at a new school, and began the process of rebuilding myself from the ground up. The scars from that time will always be there, reminders of the choices I made and the people I hurt. But I've learned to live with them, to carry them as part of my story. A story that, despite all the pain and regret, has led me to a place of healing and growth. As time passed, I began to realize that the hardest part of moving on wasn't just the guilt or the shame. It was learning to live with the silence that followed. The echoes of my choices haunted me, but slowly I came to understand that the road to redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about accepting it. Months turned into a year, and in that time I learned to rebuild my life piece by piece. The new town where I settled was quiet, almost sleepy, and it provided the peace I so desperately needed. I found a small, cozy apartment overlooking a park where I often sat in the evenings, watching the sunset and reflecting on everything that had brought me here. The church was no longer a central part of my life, but my faith remained in a quiet, personal way. I no longer sought answers in the sermons or guidance from others. I found them within, through long conversations with myself and prayers that came from a place of deep reflection. Teaching children again became my anchor, a source of joy that pulled me out of the dark moments when I doubted myself. In their innocence, I found hope that, despite my mistakes, I could still make a positive impact on the world around me. I threw myself into my work, finding comfort in the laughter of the children and the knowledge that I was helping shape young minds. But there were still nights when the loneliness crept in, when I lay awake thinking about Samuel, wondering where he was, what he was doing, and whether he had found happiness without me. I never tried to contact him. I knew that part of my life was over, and there was no going back. Still, the thought of him lingered like a shadow, a reminder of the life I had once cherished and destroyed. One evening, while I was sitting on a park bench, watching the sky turn a deep shade of purple, I received a message on my phone. It was from an unknown number. Hesitant, I opened it and my heart skipped a beat. It was Samuel. "Julia, I don't know if you'll ever want to hear from me, but I just wanted to say that I hope you're doing well. I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything that happened. I've moved on, but I wanted you to know that despite the pain, I don't hold anything against you anymore." I hope you found peace too. Take care." I stared at the message, my chest tightening. It was the closure I never expected to receive. Samuel's words felt like a final release, a forgiveness I hadn't even realized I was waiting for. For so long, I had been trapped in my own guilt, unable to forgive myself. But now, with those simple words, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I sat there, letting the moment sink in. Samuel had moved on. He had found peace, and now I realized I could too. Later that night, after sitting with my thoughts, I sent him a short message. "Pack. Thank you, Samuel. I wish you happiness truly. I'm working on finding peace, and your message means more than you know. Take care." And with that, I let go. The following weeks were different. The ache that had been with me for so long began to fade, replaced by a sense of quiet acceptance. I started focusing on the future, not as a way to escape the past, but as a way to honor it. I knew I couldn't change what had happened, but I could learn from it. I could grow from it. Eventually, I started making new friends in my little town, opening myself up to connections that weren't tainted by the mistakes of my past. There were moments of happiness, small, simple moments that made me smile again. I even began dating, though cautiously, knowing that I wasn't ready for anything serious. Still, it was a step forward. The lessons I learned from that time in my life were painful, but they shaped me into someone stronger. I learned that love, real love, requires effort and care, that passion and desire can't replace trust and understanding. And I learned that forgiveness, both of others and of ourselves, is essential if we are ever to move forward. One day, while walking through the park, I paused to watch a group of children playing. Their laughter filled the air, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of contentment wash over me. I realized that the life I was building, though different from what I had once imagined, was still full of possibility. I would always carry the memories of my past with me, the mistakes, the regrets, and the lessons. But I no longer felt weighed down by them. I had forgiven myself, and in doing so, I had opened the door to a future that, though uncertain, was mine to shape. As I stood there watching the sunset once again, I smiled to myself. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, I felt ready to face it with an open heart. Before you leave, remember to subscribe to the channel by activating the Tinkerbell to receive notification every time.